The city of Genoa in the early 1450s was a place where the sea dictated the rhythm of life. Narrow alleys twisted through tall stone houses, and the constant clamor of trade echoed off the harbor walls. Ships creaked in the docks as ropes strained against wooden posts, sails flapped in the breeze, and men shouted in a dozen different tongues: Italian, Greek, Arabic, Catalan, and more. For Genoa was not just a city, it was a crossroads of the Mediterranean world, a republic built on maritime power, where fortunes were won and lost at sea. In this vibrant, restless city, a boy named Cristoforo Colombo, later known to the world as Christopher Columbus, was born. His father, Domenico, was a wool weaver, not a man of wealth or high standing, but steady in his work. His mother, Susanna, kept the family together as best as she could, raising Christopher and his siblings in a modest household. By the expectations of his family and community, Christopher was destined to inherit the loom, to carry on the trade that provided them food and shelter. Yet even as a child, Columbus was restless. The weaving trade, with its endless repetition of thread and fabric, felt too small for the boy whose imagination reached far beyond the streets of Genoa. The real excitement, he believed, was to be found at the port, and so, whenever he could, Columbus wandered down to the harbor, where the smell of salt water mingled with tar and fish, and the sound of sailors' stories carried across the busy docks. It was there that his imagination first took flight. He listened to mariners speak of storms so fierce they split ships in two, of strange islands spotted on the edge of the known seas, of riches in far-off markets, where cinnamon, pepper, and gold seemed as common as grain in Genoa. These stories were not written in books, but carried in the rough voices of men who had seen the world's dangers and temptations. To Christopher, they were like glimpses into another life, a life of adventure, courage, and endless horizons. At night, when Genoa fell quiet, Columbus often looked to the stars. He had heard sailors speak of how the heavens guided them, how the position of the North Star could mark direction even in the darkest night. The sky, vast and mysterious, fascinated him, while other boys his age thought only of apprenticeships, guilds, and family duties. Columbus was already dreaming of oceans untraveled, of routes unknown, of secrets waiting at the world's edge. But dreams alone were not enough. Genoa was a city of hard realities, where ambition could be crushed by poverty or circumstance. Columbus's family had little wealth, and his path seemed firmly set in the weaver's trade. Yet, Christopher was determined. As he grew older, he found ways to break free from the loom, first working in small sailing ventures along the Ligurian coast, then venturing further into the Mediterranean. Each voyage taught him something new: the way winds shifted across seasons, the patterns of tides, the dangers of sudden storms that could wreck a ship in moments. By the time he was in his teens, Columbus had survived shipwrecks, fought against pirates, and endured voyages that tested his endurance and courage. These experiences carved into him a hardened spirit, a sense that the sea, though merciless, was also the truest path to greatness. He began to study whatever writings he could find. Ancient maps, though often inaccurate and filled with fantastical beasts beyond their borders, intrigued him. He learned Latin so he could read scholarly works on geography and navigation. He devoured the tales of Marco Polo, whose descriptions of the riches of Asia stirred in Columbus the belief that great lands lay waiting beyond the ocean. The more he learned, the more he became convinced the seas were not barriers but bridges. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was a faster route to the riches of the East than the long, perilous journeys around Africa. To many, the Atlantic Ocean was a place of dread, a sea of darkness that swallowed men whole. But to Columbus, it was not darkness he saw, it was opportunity. Still, he was just a young man from a humble background, with no fleet, no royal favor, no fortune to his name. His family could not understand his hunger. Why abandon the security of weaving for the uncertainties of the sea? Why dream of lands no man had seen? To them his ambitions were folly, but to Christopher they were destiny. As Christopher Columbus entered his teenage years, his path began to diverge from the life his father had intended. Domenico Colombo's workshop echoed with the rhythm of the loom, but Christopher's heart beat to the rhythm of the waves. The fabric of wool, though essential for survival, seemed lifeless compared to the great sails that billowed above the ships in Genoa's harbor. It was in these formative years that Columbus began to take his first real steps toward the sea. He secured work as a cabin boy and apprentice on trading vessels that plied the Mediterranean waters, carrying goods between Italian ports, North Africa, and the coasts of Spain and Portugal. For a boy of humble birth, this was not a glamorous position. It meant long hours, heavy labor, and constant exposure to danger. Yet for Columbus, each voyage was a lesson, a classroom far larger than any found on land. Life aboard ship was harsh. The Mediterranean, though familiar to seasoned sailors, could be as treacherous as the open Atlantic. Columbus learned quickly that the sea demanded discipline. He scrubbed decks, hauled ropes, and endured the cramped quarters below. Food was simple and often foul: hardtack, salted fish, and water that quickly turned stale. Rats, lice, and sickness were constant companions. But alongside hardship, there was knowledge. Columbus absorbed everything he could from the older sailors. They taught him how to read the stars at night, how to judge the speed of a vessel by the water rushing past the hull, how to predict winds by the color of the sky. He watched navigators sketch crude maps and charts, marking routes with the confidence of men who trusted experience more than parchment. He listened to the tales of veteran captains who spoke of distant places: Alexandria, Tunis, Lisbon, each name filling his imagination with a sense of wonder. By his mid-teens, Columbus had already sailed to far corners of the Mediterranean. He visited ports in Greece, the Balearic Islands, and possibly even ventured as far as England on merchant expeditions. Each voyage strengthened his resolve, shaping him into more than a sailor, into a navigator. He began to study navigation, not just as a skill, but as an art. With whatever resources he could find, he learned Latin to read the works of scholars. He studied the writings of Ptolemy and the accounts of Marco Polo, convinced that hidden within these texts were clues that would one day lead him to glory. But learning came not only from books, it came from storms that threatened to swallow ships whole. Columbus experienced the sudden terror of blackened skies, waves taller than the mast, and winds that ripped sails to shreds. He survived encounters with pirates who prowled the Mediterranean, seeking easy prey among merchant vessels. Once, it was said, he swam for his life after his ship was attacked and burned, clinging to wreckage until he reached the safety of shore. These trials left scars, some physical, some deeper, but they also built in him an unshakable resilience. By the age of 20, Columbus was no longer the wool weaver's son dabbling at sea. He was a hardened mariner with years of experience behind him. He had faced storms, battles, and shipwrecks. He had seen the bustling markets of foreign ports. He had touched the edges of the known world. Yet, with each passing voyage, his ambition only grew. The Mediterranean, for all its wonders, felt too small. Columbus began to imagine voyages that reached beyond familiar waters. The spice trade, controlled by Venetians and Ottomans, dominated European markets. To reach Asia by land was long, dangerous, and costly. To sail south around Africa was a bold idea, already being pursued by the Portuguese. But Columbus's mind turned elsewhere. What if one could sail west, not south, not east, but west, across the great Atlantic? This was not yet a plan, but a spark, a thought born of experience, study, and a hunger for more. Columbus was still a young man, lacking patronage, wealth, and ships of his own, but already the outlines of his destiny were forming. He was not content to be a sailor who carried the goods of others. He dreamed of being the one whose name was written on maps, whose voyages changed the course of history. By the time Christopher Columbus reached his 20s, the Mediterranean was no longer a mystery. He had sailed its waters from coast to coast, touched the ports of Italy, Spain, and North Africa, and even ventured further north along the Atlantic coasts of Portugal, and perhaps as far as England. He was no longer simply a sailor, he was becoming a thinker, a man whose ambitions reached beyond the horizons familiar to others. The spark that began to guide Columbus more than any other was the vision of the Indies, the great markets of Asia. For centuries, Europe had coveted the riches of the East, silks from China, spices from India, gold, gems, and exotic goods that seemed almost magical to those who had never seen them. These treasures traveled to Europe by long and dangerous land routes, winding through deserts, mountains, and the territories of hostile powers. By Columbus's time, much of that trade was controlled by Muslim empires, especially the Ottomans, who made the flow of Eastern goods costly and uncertain. The question that haunted many European minds was simple: could there be another way? The Portuguese had already begun pushing south along the coast of Africa, searching for a route around the Cape of Good Hope. Prince Henry the Navigator had set his country on a path of exploration, and one by one, Portuguese ships sailed further into unknown waters, mapping the coastline of Africa and establishing footholds in distant lands. Columbus admired these ventures, but his imagination pointed in a different direction. He had studied the works of ancient and medieval scholars, and one idea captivated him: the earth was round. If the world was indeed a sphere, then the East might be reached not only by traveling south and east, but by sailing west, beyond the Atlantic, beyond the sea of darkness feared by many sailors. He believed lay a direct route to Asia. This was not a universally accepted belief. While most educated men did agree that the earth was round, few thought it wise or even possible to sail directly west across the Atlantic. The ocean was vast, its size uncertain, and no one knew what lay beyond. Many still spoke of sea monsters and cursed waters, where ships would be dragged into the abyss. But Columbus, with his mix of practical sailing experience and stubborn imagination, began to see what others dismissed as fantasy: a shortcut to the riches of the Indies. He pored over maps and charts, crude as they were, sketching his own ideas, calculating distances, and convincing himself that Asia lay closer than most believed. His mind returned again and again to the words of Marco Polo, whose descriptions of the golden cities of Cathay, China, and the wealth of Cipangu, Japan, fired his ambition. If such lands existed, and if they could be reached by a bold voyage westward, then whoever commanded that route would hold unimaginable power. For Columbus, this was more than a geographical puzzle. It was a vision, a destiny. He began to believe that he was chosen for this task, that Providence itself had placed this dream in his heart. His faith, already strong, became intertwined with his ambition. To reach the Indies by sailing west would not only enrich his patrons, it would, he believed, serve God by bringing new souls into Christendom. But visions alone could not launch ships. Columbus was still a man of modest means, without noble blood or great wealth. To turn his dream into reality, he needed support, powerful patrons, ships, men, and resources. And so, while he continued to sail and learn, his mind increasingly turned toward the courts of Europe. Somewhere, he believed, there must be a king or queen willing to take the risk, to gamble on a dream that others mocked. The idea of the Indies became the fire that drove him. In taverns, among sailors, and even in private writings, he spoke of it, though often he was dismissed as a dreamer. Yet Columbus was no ordinary dreamer. He was relentless. His life at sea had given him endurance, and his vision gave him purpose. While others saw only the dangers of the Atlantic, he saw a path to glory. And so the image of the Indies, its riches, its promise, its allure, took root in his mind. It would guide every decision he made from this point forward. Columbus was no longer simply a navigator searching for work. He was a man possessed by an idea that would carry him across oceans and into history. The wool weaver's son from Genoa now dreamed of empires, kingdoms, and discoveries. His eyes no longer looked to the Mediterranean, but to the Atlantic, vast and unknown. And in that unknown, he believed, lay his destiny. By the mid-1470s, Christopher Columbus had matured into more than just a sailor. He was a navigator, a thinker, and increasingly a man consumed by vision. His voyages across the Mediterranean had taught him the skills of seamanship, but it was in Portugal, a kingdom brimming with maritime ambition, that his ideas began to sharpen and take shape. Lisbon was, at that time, the beating heart of European exploration. The Portuguese crown, under King John II, was determined to secure a sea route to Asia, with caravels cutting southward along the African coast, charting each new cape and establishing trading posts. Portugal was building an empire of discovery. Lisbon's harbors teemed with explorers, merchants, and mapmakers. Stories of voyages filled the air, and men returned with gold dust, slaves, ivory, and pepper from the coasts of Africa. It was here that Columbus found himself, drawn to the epicenter of Europe's boldest experiments at sea. He quickly realized that in Portugal, unlike in Genoa, dreams of far-off lands were not dismissed. They were state policy. For Columbus, whose mind was fixed on reaching Asia by sailing westward, Portugal seemed like the ideal place to find patrons willing to listen. During these years, Columbus lived among fellow navigators, often working as a chartmaker and sailor to support himself. He married Philippa Muniz Perestrello, the daughter of a Portuguese nobleman and former governor of Madeira. This marriage, modest as it was, gave Columbus entry into a higher circle of society than he had ever known before. Through Philippa's family, Columbus gained access to valuable maps, charts, and records of Portuguese voyages. Madeira itself was a launching point for Atlantic ventures, and its archives provided him with material that would fuel his theories. Portugal also offered Columbus something else: exposure to the open Atlantic. From Lisbon and Madeira, he sailed westward to the Azores, and possibly even further north, where he encountered vast, unpredictable waters, unlike the enclosed Mediterranean. The Atlantic was a different world. Its swells higher, its winds stronger, its dangers greater. But instead of deterring him, these voyages strengthened his conviction that the ocean could be crossed, that beyond the horizon lay not monsters or oblivion, but land. At last, Columbus decided it was time to act on his vision. He prepared a formal proposal to the Portuguese crown, grant him ships and men to sail westward across the Atlantic to reach the riches of Asia. He promised untold wealth, new lands, and an advantage over rival kingdoms. He painted his plan as both profitable and divinely ordained. But the court of King John II was cautious. Portugal already had a plan, sailing around Africa. The king's advisors studied Columbus's proposal carefully, and while they acknowledged his skill and passion, they saw flaws. His calculations of the Earth's size were far too small. Columbus believed Asia lay much closer than it truly did. To his critics, this made his plan dangerous, if not impossible. Why gamble on a risky, untested route when Portuguese ships were already making steady progress down the African coast? The answer from Lisbon came as a bitter disappointment. Columbus's request was denied. Some accounts even suggest that his ideas were tested in secret by Portuguese sailors, who returned with little success, further discrediting him. Columbus's dream of sailing west to the Indies seemed for the moment out of reach. Yet rejection did not extinguish his ambition. It hardened it. Columbus remained in Portugal for several years, continuing his work as a navigator and trader. He sailed as far as Iceland, according to some reports, where he encountered icy seas and long summer days. These experiences only deepened his knowledge of winds, currents, and the vastness of the ocean. But deep inside, he knew that Lisbon would never be the place to fulfill his vision. The Portuguese crown was committed to its own path. If Columbus's idea was to succeed, he would need to take it elsewhere, to a kingdom bold enough, desperate enough, or visionary enough to take the gamble. And so, with disappointment in his heart but determination still burning, Christopher Columbus began to turn his gaze westward once more, not just toward the ocean, but toward new patrons. Beyond Portugal, he believed, lay his chance. Somewhere a ruler would recognize the promise in his vision. It would not be easy. More rejections awaited him, more years of struggle, wandering, and humiliation. But Columbus was not a man who surrendered to doubt. He carried his vision with him like a compass pointing unerringly to the west. Christopher Columbus had poured his heart into his dream of sailing westward. In Portugal, he had studied maps, married into a family with connections to maritime exploration, and even petitioned King John II himself. Yet his proposal had been dismissed, branded impractical, reckless, and far too costly. For many, such rejection would have been the end. But Columbus was not a man to abandon a vision once it had taken root. By the early 1480s, the rejection weighed heavily upon him. He knew he needed the support of a powerful monarch, for such an expedition was no small venture. It required ships, supplies, skilled crews, and above all, trust. Columbus could not fund this himself, nor could wealthy merchants be persuaded to risk fortunes on what most considered folly. Only a crown could gamble on such a vision. Columbus first turned again to Portugal, hoping persistence might win the king's favor. He refined his arguments emphasizing the wealth that lay waiting in Cathay, China and Sipangu, Japan. But once more, the Portuguese court dismissed him. Their eyes were fixed on Africa, where each new voyage promised tangible results. To them, Columbus's westward plan was little more than a dangerous fantasy. Frustrated but undeterred, Columbus set his sights on Spain. At that time, Spain itself was in flux. The kingdoms of Castile and Aragon had been united by the marriage of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, but their attention was consumed by the Reconquista, the long struggle to drive the Moors from the Iberian Peninsula. To Columbus, however, Spain seemed a land of possibility. Its rulers were ambitious, eager to match or surpass Portugal's growing power at sea. If anyone could be persuaded to take a chance, perhaps it would be Isabella and Ferdinand. In 1485, Columbus made his way to Spain. It was not an easy journey. He was poor, his wife had died, and he now had a young son, Diego, to care for. Yet, with a resilience born of desperation, Columbus pressed on. He sought audiences with noblemen, scholars, and clergymen, hoping to find someone who would carry his ideas to the royal court. At last, his proposal was placed before Isabella and Ferdinand. He promised them unimaginable rewards, new lands filled with gold, spices, and riches, dominion over territories before unknown to Christendom, and the chance to spread the Christian faith to souls across the ocean. He argued not only as a navigator, but as a man of God, portraying his plan as a divine mission. But the Spanish monarchs, though intrigued, were cautious. Their treasury was strained from war, and their advisors were skeptical. Columbus's calculations were suspect. He insisted that Asia lay much closer than it truly did, a dangerous underestimation of the Earth's size. Learned scholars at Salamanca examined his proposals and shook their heads. The risks were too great, the chances of success too slim. Once again, Columbus faced rejection. His hopes, so carefully built, seemed to collapse. For years he wandered through Spain, supporting himself as best he could while continuing to seek favor. He wrote letters, argued with scholars, pleaded with nobles. Sometimes he was dismissed outright. Other times promised consideration that led to nothing. His dream became a burden, both for himself and for those around him. Yet Columbus refused to abandon it. In moments of doubt, he turned to his faith, convinced that God had chosen him for this mission. He saw himself as an instrument of divine will, destined to carry the cross to lands across the sea. To abandon his vision in his mind would be to defy providence itself. Years of rejection left him weary, but not broken. He endured poverty, ridicule, and uncertainty. Still, he pressed forward, carrying his idea like a flame in the darkness. Though monarchs and scholars dismissed him, Columbus believed the day would come when someone would listen, truly listen, and grant him the chance to prove them all wrong. The wool weaver's son from Genoa, dismissed by Portugal and doubted in Spain, might have seemed a failure, yet his persistence was unshakable. For Columbus, rejection was not the end. It was only another step on the long, hard road toward destiny. By the late 1480s, Christopher Columbus had grown into a man whose mind was dominated by a single, unshakable vision to sail west across the Atlantic and reach the riches of Asia. He had studied the maps of the ancients, charted seas with his own eyes, and learned the secrets of winds, currents, and celestial navigation. He had faced storms, survived shipwrecks, and navigated treacherous waters in the Mediterranean and Atlantic. Yet all of this experience was worthless without the support of a powerful patron. Columbus knew that to embark on a transatlantic voyage, he would need ships, men, provisions, and the blessing of royalty. Without backing from a crown, his dreams would remain nothing more than theories scribbled on parchment. He first turned to Portugal, the kingdom renowned for its maritime explorations. The Portuguese were pioneers, steadily mapping the African coast and establishing trading posts along distant shores. They had the expertise, the ships, and the resources. Columbus believed that Portugal might be persuaded to take a gamble on his plan, which promised a shortcut to the Indies. He approached King John II with a carefully prepared proposal, highlighting the potential wealth, trade opportunities, and Christian expansion his voyage could achieve. At first, the court seemed intrigued. Some advisors were impressed with his knowledge of navigation and his detailed calculations, but the king's senior counselors were cautious. Columbus's calculations were far off. He believed the distance to Asia was far shorter than reality. To them, the Atlantic appeared infinite and unforgiving. They argued that the risk of losing ships, men, and treasure was far too high. Columbus's proposal was politely dismissed. Unwilling to accept defeat, Columbus decided to seek his fortune elsewhere. Spain, newly united under Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, became his next hope. Spain was ambitious and eager to compete with Portugal, yet it was also deeply entangled in the Reconquista, the long campaign to expel the Moors from Granada. Even if the Spanish crown had been inclined toward exploration, their resources were stretched thin. Columbus arrived in Spain with little money, a young son Diego in tow, and the weight of years of rejection upon his shoulders. He presented his ideas to nobles, church officials, and scholars, traveling tirelessly in hope of securing an audience with the monarchs. In these early years, he endured humiliation and skepticism. Scholars from the University of Salamanca examined his maps and calculations and shook their heads. Nobles questioned the wisdom of sending men into the unknown. Many whispered that he was mad, that his dreams were dangerous fantasies. Yet Columbus refused to give in. He leveraged his knowledge, experience, and faith, speaking passionately of the wealth of the Indies, the spices, gold, and silk that awaited Spain, and the souls that could be converted to Christianity. He portrayed his plan as not just a commercial venture, but a mission sanctioned by God. He insisted that he was the chosen instrument to carry the cross and expand Christendom across previously unknown lands. Despite his eloquence, the Spanish court remained hesitant. The war with Granada consumed resources, and the royal advisors were cautious with promises of ships and men. Columbus was forced to wait, his plans in limbo for years. During this time, he continued to refine his calculations, study maps, and write letters advocating his plan. He gained some allies, minor nobles who believed in his vision, but none with the influence to change the monarch's minds immediately. This period of waiting was a test of patience, resolve, and endurance. Columbus faced poverty, the mockery of skeptics, and the frustration of delays. Each rejection could have broken a lesser man, yet Columbus endured. He continued to present his plan with unwavering confidence, believing that persistence would eventually win the favor of a monarch brave enough to take the risk. After years of tireless advocacy, endless travel, and relentless rejection, Christopher Columbus finally found himself at the threshold of destiny. Spain, newly united under Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, had emerged from decades of internal conflict. The Reconquista, a grueling campaign to expel the last remnants of Moorish rule, had just concluded with the fall of Granada in January 1492. The kingdom was victorious but exhausted, its coffers strained, and its people weary. Yet, with the completion of the Reconquista, the monarch's gaze began to shift outward to lands beyond their known world. It was in this moment of national transition that Columbus saw his opportunity. Armed with detailed charts, carefully measured maps, and a vision that extended far beyond the known horizons, Columbus presented himself once again at the Spanish court. He spoke not only of distant lands rich in spices, silks, and gold, but also of the spiritual imperative new peoples awaiting the light of Christianity. A westward course, he argued, can shorten the path to the Indies and bring the wealth of Asia directly to Spain, opening new trade and spreading the Christian faith to unknown peoples. His words, delivered with a blend of scholarly knowledge, unwavering conviction, and a quiet intensity, captivated many in the court. But skepticism lingered. Advisors and scholars challenged his plan. Some mocked the idea outright, claiming that the ocean was vast beyond measure and that ships could never survive such a journey. Others questioned his calculations, noting that even a small misstep could send a fleet into a watery abyss. Despite the criticism, Columbus maintained his composure. He countered each objection with meticulous reasoning, citing astronomical observations, previous voyages, and historical accounts of winds and currents. Slowly, the seeds of belief began to take root among the court, as even the most cautious advisors could not ignore Columbus's persistence and preparation. Yet securing royal favor was no simple task. Columbus demanded extraordinary rewards: the title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, governorship over any new lands, a share of profits, and authority to appoint officials in the territories he discovered. Many in the court considered his requests audacious, verging on arrogant. It would have been easy for the monarchs to dismiss him entirely, but Ferdinand and Isabella, pragmatic and ambitious, recognized the opportunity. They saw in Columbus not only a man of vision but a potential instrument of Spain's expansion, a way to compete with Portugal and establish Spain as a dominant maritime power. Behind the scenes, negotiations were intense and drawn out. Spain's treasury was depleted after decades of war. Advisors fretted over the cost of ships, crews, and provisions. Columbus, ever resourceful, offered assurances that he would oversee the organization of the expedition personally, contributing his own funds and helping secure additional investment. His tenacity, combined with his unshakable belief in the success of his plan, gradually wore down resistance. Nobles and courtiers who had been skeptical began lobbying on his behalf, emphasizing the potential wealth and prestige Spain could gain. Finally, in April 1492, the long wait came to an end. At Santa Fe near Granada, Ferdinand and Isabella signed the historic capitulations of Santa Fe, granting Columbus the titles, privileges, and authority he had requested. The monarchs pledged ships, crews, and provisions, committing Spain to a voyage of unprecedented ambition. For Columbus, the document was more than a contract. It was the validation of a lifelong dream, a tangible acknowledgement of his perseverance, knowledge, and vision. Columbus's emotions on that day were a complex mixture of relief, triumph, and renewed determination. He had endured years of rejection in Portugal,
skepticism from learned men, and bureaucratic obstacles at every turn. Yet now, with the royal promise in hand, the path to history was open. The challenge was no longer convincing others, it was preparing for the voyage itself. He would need to select a capable crew, provision ships for months at sea, and face the unknown dangers of the Atlantic. But in that moment, Columbus allowed himself to savor the victory. He had turned dreams into reality, secured the backing of one of Europe's most powerful monarchs, and set the stage for a journey that would alter the world forever.
The air in the bustling port of Palos de la Frontera was thick with salt smoke and the nervous chatter of sailors. Ships creaked against their moorings, seagulls circled overhead, and merchants shouted over the clamor of barrels and crates. For Christopher Columbus, every sight and sound carried the weight of anticipation. After years of convincing monarchs and navigating court politics, the voyage he had dreamed of for decades was finally within reach. Yet the practical challenges of transforming vision into reality were immense. The first task was selecting the vessels. Columbus had requested 3 ships: the flagship Santa Maria, a robust carrack capable of long ocean travel, and 2 smaller caravels, the Nina and the Pinta, known for their speed and maneuverability. Each vessel had to be seaworthy, stocked with provisions, and manned by crews loyal enough to endure months of uncertainty. Columbus inspected every hull, mast, and sail with meticulous care, noting weaknesses and ensuring that repairs were completed before departure. Every plank and rope mattered. A single failure could doom the expedition before it even left Spain. Next came the recruitment of the crew. The sailors were a mix of seasoned mariners and inexperienced adventurers, many drawn by promises of wealth, land, or simply the allure of adventure. Morale was fragile, fear of the unknown was palpable. Columbus had to balance authority with inspiration. He reminded them of Spain's glory, the riches of the Indies, and the honor they would gain by joining this historic endeavor. Yet whispers of doubt persisted. Some feared the sea of darkness, imagining waters that would swallow ships whole. Others questioned their captain's calculations, insisting the journey was impossible. Columbus faced the delicate task of asserting leadership while maintaining trust and confidence. Provisioning the ships was another monumental challenge. Food had to last for months, requiring salted meats, hard biscuits, beans, cheese, and barrels of water and wine. Tools for navigation, including astrolabes, compasses, and hourglasses, were secured, along with charts and maps meticulously drawn and annotated by Columbus himself. He also ordered trade goods, beads, mirrors, and trinkets to offer as gifts to the peoples he anticipated encountering. Every detail, from rope to anchor, cannon to cooking pot, was considered, for the survival of the expedition depended on thorough preparation. As the departure date neared, tension in the port grew. Local officials worried about the potential loss of ships, merchants fretted over unpaid debts, and families agonized over the men who would leave their homes for what could be a fatal journey. Superstitions ran rampant. Some sailors carried charms, prayed fervently, or consulted astrologers, convinced that omens would guide or curse the voyage. Columbus, ever focused on the practical and spiritual alike, balanced these fears with firm leadership. He encouraged his crew, yet reminded them that courage and faith were as necessary as skill and preparation. On the night before departure, Columbus walked along the docks, gazing at the 3 ships lying side by side. The Santa Maria, with its broad hull, seemed regal yet vulnerable, a symbol of the journey's enormity. The Nina and Pinta, smaller and swifter, bobbed in the gentle waves, ready to test the Atlantic's might. Columbus's mind raced with calculations, contingencies, and dreams. He imagined distant lands, uncharted waters, and encounters that would challenge everything Europeans thought they knew about the world. Finally, as the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the fleet was ready. Sailors climbed aboard, sails were unfurled, and anchors were lifted. Columbus, standing on the deck of the Santa Maria, addressed his crew one last time. He spoke of courage, destiny, and honor, urging them to remember that they were embarking on a journey that could change history forever. Some men wept, some prayed, and others simply gripped the railings, hearts pounding with fear and excitement. When the fleet finally slipped away from Palos, the cheers of onlookers echoed across the water. The ships moved into open sea, guided only by the stars, compass, and Columbus's unwavering determination. The Atlantic lay before them, vast, unpredictable, and full of promise. Supplies were limited, the route uncertain, and the dangers unknown. Yet in the heart of every sailor, and in the mind of their captain, a shared conviction pulsed. They were stepping into the pages of history, and the world beyond the horizon awaited. The journey had begun, and with it, the first steps toward a new world that would forever alter the course of humanity. The morning sun rose over Palos de la Frontera as the three ships, Santa Maria, Pinta, and Nina, cut through the waves, leaving Spain behind. Families on the shore waved tearful goodbyes, their cries mixing with the creaking of ropes and the flapping of sails. For the crew, many of whom had never ventured far beyond the familiar coasts of Europe or Africa, the sight of the endless Atlantic was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Columbus, standing on the deck of the Santa Maria, felt a mixture of exhilaration and solemn responsibility. The journey had begun, and there was no turning back. In the first days at sea, life aboard the ships settled into a careful routine. Sailors tended to sails, cleaned decks, repaired fraying ropes, and kept watch for signs of land or danger. Columbus studied the stars with precision, using his compass and charts to chart the fleet's course westward. Nights were spent measuring latitude with astrolabes and hourglasses, while during the day, sailors scanned the horizon for signs of reefs, storms, or distant islands. Yet the monotony of the open ocean weighed heavily on everyone. The vastness of the Atlantic, unbroken by land, made time stretch and minds wander. Tensions began to rise. Many sailors, unused to such prolonged isolation, grew fearful and restless. Rumors whispered in the shadows of the ship spoke of falling off the edge of the world, monstrous sea creatures, and the wrath of God for venturing too far from Europe. Some questioned Columbus's calculations, muttering that he had underestimated the distance and that they would run out of food and water before ever seeing land. Even the strongest men found themselves gripped by doubt, wondering if the promised Indies were nothing more than a fool's fantasy. Columbus, aware of the growing unease, worked tirelessly to maintain morale. He reminded the men of Spain's glory and the potential wealth that awaited them. He spoke of fame, honor, and the chance to make history, appealing to their ambition and courage. Yet he also knew that fear could not be banished with words alone. He organized extra watches, encouraged skillful sailors to lead smaller crews on routine tasks, and personally inspected every sail, rope, and supply to ensure their safety. His leadership was a delicate balance of inspiration and discipline. Too harsh and mutiny might brew, too lenient and chaos could take hold. As weeks turned into months, The journey tested both body and mind. Salt from the sea irritated skin, the sun scorched exposed arms and faces, and storms battered the ships with relentless fury. The crew endured long stretches of hunger, rationing food and water carefully. The horizon remained unbroken, a vast, empty expanse of blue that offered no comfort, no indication of the lands that might lie ahead. In these moments, despair threatened to overshadow hope. Some sailors whispered about turning back, while others clung to superstition, performing small rituals to ward off disaster. Yet amid the hardship, Columbus's unwavering resolve became the anchor that steadied the fleet. He navigated by the stars, calculated currents and winds, and pressed forward with patience and faith. Small victories, sightings of birds far from land, the occasional floating plant, or favorable winds rekindled hope among the crew. Columbus knew that the first sign of land would not just be a physical discovery, it would be proof that their struggle had meaning, that the months of fear and uncertainty were not in vain. One evening, as the sun dipped below the endless horizon, painting the sky with streaks of gold and crimson, Columbus stood on the quarterdeck, staring westward. The ocean stretched infinitely before him, mysterious and untamed. He felt the weight of responsibility, the pressure of ambition, and the silent prayers of every sailor aboard. The unknown pressed in on all sides, yet he remained resolute. This was the threshold of discovery, a place where courage, skill, and vision would be tested to their limits. And in the distance, though none yet realized it, the first hints of land stirred on the horizon. The promise of a new world beckoned, a world that would challenge everything they knew, change history forever, and etch their names into legend. Columbus's journey into the unknown ocean was only beginning, and the greatest trials and greatest rewards still lay ahead. The Atlantic stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast expanse of deep blue that seemed to mock the resolve of the sailors aboard the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Weeks of relentless sailing had tested every man's endurance, patience, and courage. Storms had lashed at their sails, winds had thrown them off course, and the endless horizon offered no reassurance. The crew murmured anxiously, their morale fraying. Whispers of mutiny began to circulate in the shadows, fueled by fear of the unknown. Many doubted the sanity of their leader, a man who insisted they would reach Asia by sailing west, despite the counsel of scholars and seasoned navigators who warned that the ocean was far too vast, and that the world might be larger than even Columbus imagined. Yet Columbus remained unshaken. Each day he rose before dawn, studying the sky, the winds and the stars. He measured the currents, calculated distances, and reminded himself and his crew that their mission was noble and necessary. Every sleepless night, every anxious glance at the horizon, every tense word spoken among his men had been endured for this purpose. He knew the risks, but he also knew the promise. Land, wealth, and fame beyond measure awaited them if only they persevered. Then, one crisp morning, as the first light of dawn crept across the rolling waves, a voice rang out from the crow's nest of the Pinta. Tierra, tierra a la vista. Land. The cry echoed across the waters, bouncing off the hulls and reaching Columbus like a thunderclap of destiny. Sailors poured from below deck, rubbing their eyes in disbelief, scanning the horizon where a dark line appeared, faint but undeniable against the endless expanse of blue. Shouts of joy, tears, and laughter erupted among the crew. After weeks of fear, uncertainty, and isolation, the impossible had become reality. Columbus's heart pounded with triumph. He stood at the bow of the Santa Maria, staring at the distant shore. Every sacrifice he had made, the years of pleading for patronage, the months of preparation, the endless calculations and observations had led to this moment. Yet he remained vigilant, aware that discovery did not end at sighting land. The unknown still held dangers, reefs, hostile wildlife, and perhaps unknown peoples. Every step now had to be taken with care, every decision weighed against the safety of his men and the success of his mission. As the ships drew closer, the landscape of the New World unfolded in astonishing detail. Dense forests stretched inland, their canopies shimmering with hues unseen in Europe. Rivers sparkled in the sunlight, snaking through valleys, and the coastline was dotted with beaches of golden sand. The air was thick with the cries of exotic birds, the scent of flowers and salt mingling in a strange, intoxicating perfume. Columbus noted everything with meticulous attention, imagining the riches, gold, spices, silks that could be found in these lands. Yet beneath his excitement lay a deeper awareness. This was a world untouched by European eyes, and every action would leave an indelible mark. The first landing was cautious and ceremonial. Columbus led a small party ashore, banners and crosses in hand. The sand beneath their feet was soft and unfamiliar, the terrain lush and vibrant. They encountered the native people cautiously observing from a distance, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Columbus watched them with careful attention, noting their clothing, tools, and demeanor. He recorded every detail in his log, aware that these observations would shape the first European understanding of the people and cultures of this new land. Flags were raised in Spain's name, prayers were offered, and solemn proclamations were made. Columbus's logs spoke of fertile land, abundant resources, and the friendliness of the inhabitants. Yet he also felt the weight of responsibility pressing upon him. This was not merely exploration, it was the beginning of a monumental encounter between civilizations. Every choice, from how to interact with the native people to how to manage his crew, would have lasting consequences for both the explorers and the indigenous communities. The morning sun cast its golden glow over the beaches where Columbus and his crew had made landfall. The air was alive with the unfamiliar songs of birds and the rustle of trees in a breeze scented with salt and the fragrance of unknown flowers. For the men who had crossed the vast, merciless Atlantic, the beauty of the land was breathtaking, but so too was the uncertainty. They were strangers in a world untouched by Europe, and every step they took was both thrilling and precarious. Columbus led a cautious expedition inland, taking careful note of everything in his path. The terrain was lush, with dense forests, sparkling rivers, and fertile plains. It was as though nature itself had been preserved in perfect harmony, unspoiled by human hands. His journals overflowed with observations, the shapes of leaves, the colors of flowers, the abundance of fruits and fresh water, and signs of wildlife, unlike anything he had seen. The world he had imagined in his dreams, the land of riches and resources that could rival the wealth of Asia, seemed to stretch before him in all directions. Then, in the distance, he saw them, the native inhabitants. They watched from a safe distance at first, their movements cautious but curious. Their clothing was simple, yet practical, and their expressions a mixture of astonishment and apprehension. Columbus approached slowly, carrying gifts of beads, mirrors, and cloth, tokens meant to show goodwill. He extended his hand in friendship, speaking words of peace and curiosity, hoping to establish trust. The indigenous people responded cautiously, their eyes wide with wonder at the strangers and their strange attire, weapons, and ships anchored offshore. Communication was difficult. They did not understand the language, and Columbus had no shared words to bridge the gap. Yet gestures, smiles, and careful observation allowed small bonds to form. Columbus noted their customs, tools, and the ways they cultivated the land. He marveled at their skill in crafting tools and boats, and at their knowledge of the natural world. Every encounter was an exchange of wonder and curiosity, a delicate dance between fear and fascination. Trade became a bridge between worlds. Columbus's men offered trinkets, beads, and cloth, and in return received food, gold ornaments, and other treasures of the land. The exchanges were cautious, but they opened the door to deeper contact and understanding. Columbus saw opportunity in every gesture, resources to report back to Spain, alliances to form, and the beginnings of a new chapter in European exploration. Yet beneath his excitement, he was aware of the fragile balance of these first interactions. Missteps could lead to conflict, and misunderstandings could ignite tension. The crew, meanwhile, grappled with the challenges of daily life in this unfamiliar land. They marveled at the abundance around them, but faced practical difficulties, securing fresh water, avoiding the dangers of unknown terrain, and managing the ever-present fear of illness. Columbus remained vigilant, balancing his role as a leader, navigator, and diplomat. He knew that their success depended on the careful management of both his men and their relationships with the native people. As days turned into weeks, Columbus documented everything with painstaking detail. He wrote of the hospitality of the natives, the potential for trade, and the natural resources he believed could enrich Spain. But he also reflected on the responsibilities that came with discovery. The world they had entered was alive with life and culture, and every choice he made would have lasting consequences for both the Europeans and the indigenous peoples. Nightfall brought reflection and solitude. Columbus stood beneath the stars, much like he had on the voyage across the Atlantic. The same constellations guided him, but now they shone over a land that was no longer a dream, but a reality. The enormity of the moment pressed upon him. He had crossed the ocean, discovered a new world, and taken the first steps into history. Yet he also understood that discovery was only the beginning. The true test lay ahead, in understanding, navigating, and respecting a world so different from his own, while pursuing the ambitions that had driven him across the seas. As the days in the new land stretched on, Columbus and his crew began to explore the islands with growing curiosity and determination. Each island held its own wonders: dense forests teeming with wildlife, rivers brimming with fresh water, and fertile soil promising crops that could sustain them. Yet beneath the beauty of this untouched world lay the pressing reality that survival and success depended on resources, and the most coveted of all was gold. Columbus had heard stories of golden cities in distant lands, and though he was unsure if this world held such wealth, he was determined to find signs of it. Every rock that glittered in the sun, every riverbed with unusual minerals, became a source of hope. He sent his men in small groups to explore, trade, and gather samples. Reports of small amounts of gold from native ornaments sparked excitement, though Columbus pressed for more, seeing in every trinket a potential treasure to claim for Spain. Life in the new land was not without tension. The men, hardened sailors who had endured months at sea, grew restless and impatient. Some doubted the existence of the riches Columbus promised, and complaints began to ripple through the camp. Food, though initially abundant, had to be rationed carefully, and fear of illness from unfamiliar diseases weighed heavily on the crew. Columbus found himself walking a delicate line between inspiring loyalty and enforcing discipline, knowing that any sign of weakness could unravel the fragile order he had established. Encounters with the native people became increasingly complex. While initial interactions had been cautious but friendly, misunderstandings began to emerge. Some of Columbus's men grew greedy, taking what they wanted without regard for the people who had welcomed them. Tensions flared, and Columbus realized that diplomacy required constant attention and care. He tried to mediate disputes, offering gifts to maintain peace, but he could not fully control the impulses of his men. Amid these challenges, Columbus's ambition burned brighter than ever. He wrote letters to the Spanish crown, describing the islands as lands rich with promise, teeming with resources, and populated by people who could be converted to Christianity. He emphasized the potential for gold and the strategic advantage of claiming these islands for Spain. In his mind, he was not merely an explorer, he was a pioneer of empire, a man destined to carve a path for his country in a world no European had yet fully seen. Yet Columbus also faced internal conflict. The weight of leadership pressed upon him. Every decision, from allocating food and water to managing interactions with the native people, was fraught with risk. One misstep could lead to mutiny among his crew or hostility from the locals. The responsibility of these choices, the knowledge that they could determine life or death, victory or disaster, haunted him in quiet moments beneath the stars. Despite the challenges, small victories fueled his determination. Successful trades brought corn, fruits, and exotic goods to the Europeans. Minor discoveries of gold, though modest, kept hope alive. Columbus carefully documented each detail, convinced that his meticulous records would one day prove the importance of his journey. Each map he drew, each observation he recorded, became part of a vision larger than any one man, a vision of exploration, conquest, and glory. By the end of this chapter of his voyage, Columbus understood that discovery was never a simple journey. It was a test of endurance, courage, and cunning, a trial that demanded both imagination and pragmatism. The promise of gold and empire beckoned, but the path to it was lined with obstacles, both natural and human. And so, with ambition as his compass and the horizon as his guide, Columbus pressed forward, determined to leave an indelible mark on the world. The islands of the Caribbean, with their lush forests and sparkling waters, had begun to feel like home to Columbus and his crew. Yet, as the novelty of discovery faded, the harsh realities of colonization set in. Columbus understood that to secure Spain's claim and to maintain order among his men, he needed permanent settlements, places from which they could govern, trade, and explore further. The first attempts at building these settlements were fraught with difficulty. Timber had to be cut and fashioned into shelters, and fields cleared for crops, all under the unrelenting sun. Food was scarce at times, and illness spread easily among the men who were already weakened from months at sea. Columbus had to manage not only the logistics of survival, but also the morale of a crew growing increasingly impatient and resentful. Complaints about harsh conditions, lack of gold, and the arduous work of establishing the settlements became frequent. Tensions with the native people also escalated. While initial encounters had been cautious but friendly, Columbus's men sometimes took more than was offered, provoking fear and resistance. Columbus faced a delicate balancing act. He needed the goodwill of the indigenous population for survival and trade, yet he also needed to assert Spanish authority to claim the land. Missteps could trigger conflict, and he knew that any outbreak of violence could undermine his authority and the Spanish crown's interests. In letters to the monarchs of Spain, Columbus portrayed the settlements as orderly and promising, emphasizing their potential to yield gold and serve as strategic outposts for further exploration. He highlighted the diligence of his men and the cooperative nature of the native populations, often omitting the hardships, mutinous whispers, and growing discontent. These letters were designed to reassure the crown and secure continued support, reflecting Columbus's skill at shaping perception, even as reality proved far more complex. The search for gold consumed Columbus's thoughts and actions. Every riverbed was examined, every hill scouted, and every interaction with the natives was filtered through the lens of discovery. He promised riches to his men, hoping to maintain their loyalty, but the intermittent rewards were often insufficient to quell their frustration. Murmurs of mutiny began to surface, and Columbus realized that leadership required not just vision, but a careful management of human ambition and fear. Despite the mounting pressures, Columbus pressed on. He organized expeditions to explore nearby islands, mapping coastlines, noting resources, and establishing rudimentary governance structures. These small but significant achievements laid the foundation for Spain's claim in the New World, even as the human cost became increasingly evident. Columbus witnessed the toll of disease on both his men and the native people, and he understood that survival in these settlements demanded constant vigilance, innovation, and at times harsh discipline. By the end of this chapter, Columbus's world had shifted. The romantic vision of discovery had given way to the harsh realities of colonization, leadership fraught with tension, settlements built through struggle, and a relentless quest for wealth that tested both character and loyalty. He was no longer merely an explorer at sea, he had become a ruler, a negotiator, and a man balancing ambition with the practical demands of survival. The promise of the new world remained, but so too did the shadow of conflict, both within his crew and with the peoples whose lands they now occupied. As the relentless Caribbean sun climbed each morning and dipped below the horizon each evening, the fledgling settlements Columbus had established bore the weight of both hope and hardship. The men who had once hailed him as a hero, an intrepid navigator who had conquered the vast Atlantic, were beginning to feel the sharp edge of reality. Their dreams of immediate wealth had collided with the unyielding hardships of the New World. Food shortages, tropical diseases, and the exhausting labor of building towns from the forested islands around them began to gnaw at their spirits. Rumors of mutiny spread like wildfire, and Columbus, who had until now relied on the awe his reputation inspired, found himself walking a delicate tightrope between authority and unrest. The complaints of his men were complex and pressing. Many had anticipated a voyage of adventure with treasures easily gathered, yet they found themselves cutting trees, clearing land, and hunting unfamiliar animals for mere sustenance. Nights were spent in humid tents swarming with insects, while days were consumed with the grueling toil of carving roads and raising rudimentary shelters. Some men fell ill from tropical fevers, others simply succumbed to despair. The disparity between the promises of gold and silk that Columbus had spoken of before the journey and the meager reality of their finds created a growing chasm of resentment. Columbus, acutely aware that maintaining morale was crucial for the survival of his settlements and the success of his mission, began to take action. He called meetings with the crew, patiently explaining the strategic importance of their work and reminding them of the support and recognition they would receive from the Spanish crown. He painted a vivid picture of the glory awaiting them, portraying each small discovery: rivers with trace amounts of gold, fertile lands, and friendly contacts with indigenous communities as monumental achievements that would secure their place in history. Yet words alone were not enough. Columbus had to enforce discipline carefully. Those who openly incited unrest or threatened the cohesion of the group were punished not with cruelty, but with stern measures designed to restore order. He walked a fine line, needing to assert authority without alienating the men completely. At the same time, he had to manage the indigenous populations they encountered. Some communities offered food, guidance, and friendship, while others resisted the European presence. Columbus navigated these relationships with a combination of diplomacy and, when necessary, coercion, always aiming to establish Spain's dominance without provoking full-scale rebellion among either his men or the natives. The search for gold remained the primary obsession. Columbus organized repeated exploratory missions into the interior of islands, searching riverbeds, mountains, and forests for precious metals. Each return with only modest amounts tested the patience of the men, but Columbus understood the importance of perception. In his letters to Spain, he often exaggerated the findings, describing islands brimming with gold and resources, carefully crafting a narrative to assure Ferdinand and Isabella that their investment was sound. These reports, though optimistic, were tempered by the harsh realities he documented in his personal journals, revealing the tension between aspiration and actuality that defined his leadership. Amidst this struggle, the dynamics within the crew became ever more complex. Alliances shifted, whispers of rebellion persisted, and morale was fragile. Columbus's leadership was tested daily. He needed to be a visionary, a diplomat, a strategist, and at times a disciplinarian. The balance between encouragement and enforcement became a constant act of navigation, rivaling the challenges of steering a ship across uncharted waters. By the time this chapter closes, the Caribbean settlements stood as a testament to both Columbus's relentless ambition and the precariousness of human endeavor. The men had labored tirelessly, and Spain had established its foothold in the New World, yet the shadow of rebellion and the challenges of colonial life loomed over every success. Columbus's dream of discovery was alive, but now inseparably intertwined with the human costs of exploration, the uncertainties of leadership, and the fragile bonds between conqueror and crew. Each decision he made would ripple forward, shaping not only the fate of his men, but the unfolding story of European expansion into the Americas. After years of arduous travel, the endless toil of building settlements, and navigating the complexities of leadership in the New World, Columbus finally prepared for the journey back to Spain. The decision to return was not born solely of triumph. It was also forced by necessity. His settlements faced dwindling supplies, restless men, and the constant challenge of maintaining authority over both the crew and the indigenous populations. Reports of rebellion and dissatisfaction had reached him in whispers and letters, reminding him that leadership in uncharted lands was as much about survival as discovery. The voyage across the Atlantic was fraught with challenges. Columbus had to manage not only the natural dangers of the ocean, storms, shifting winds, and treacherous currents, but also the fragile morale of his crew, many of whom were exhausted, disillusioned, or ill. Men who had once idolized him now questioned his decisions. Rumors of mutiny persisted, and tensions threatened to boil over at any moment. Columbus, ever the tactician, worked tirelessly to maintain discipline. He spoke with patience and authority, reminding the men of the glory that awaited them in Spain, the favor of the crown, and the treasures that had already been discovered. As the ships pressed onward across the Atlantic, Columbus also carried with him the weight of his own ambitions. Every decision, every course plotted, was influenced by his vision of a world reshaped by Spanish discovery and conquest. Yet the reality he returned with was far more complicated than the legends of gold and exotic riches he had promised. Many of the islands yielded only modest amounts of gold, and the fledgling settlements were vulnerable and fragile. Columbus understood that his reports to Ferdinand and Isabella would need careful crafting. They had invested heavily in his expedition, and their support would be critical for future voyages. Upon arrival in Spain, Columbus was met with a mixture of celebration and scrutiny. The Spanish court received him as a hero who had crossed the Atlantic and discovered lands unknown to Europeans. Crowds gathered to hear tales of his daring journey, and letters from his crew and settlers recounted both the wonders and the hardships of the New World. Yet behind the celebrations, political tensions simmered. Some questioned the legitimacy of his claims and the methods he had used to manage his crew and the indigenous people. His exaggerated reports of wealth and resources intended to secure favor also drew criticism when the reality fell short of expectation. Despite these challenges, Columbus remained resolute. He presented the crown with maps, reports, and samples of gold, exotic spices, and other curiosities from the New World, emphasizing the potential for wealth, trade, and expansion. His vision of a Spanish empire in the Americas was now tangible, even if imperfectly realized. Yet the political landscape of Spain was complex, and Columbus had to navigate the ambitions of rival nobles, the scrutiny of royal advisors, and the growing awareness that the New World would be far more difficult to control than anyone had imagined. The return also forced Columbus to confront his own legacy. He had fulfilled his dream of crossing the Atlantic, but the cost had been high. Tensions with his men, the struggles of the settlements, and the moral complexities of interacting with indigenous populations weighed heavily on him. He understood that the story he told upon his return would shape both his reputation and the future of Spanish exploration. He needed to portray triumph while managing the inevitable criticism and envy that surrounded a man of his ambition. As this chapter closes, Columbus's return to Spain marks a pivotal moment in his life and in history. He had proven that the Atlantic could be crossed, that lands unknown to Europe existed beyond the horizon, and that the dream of exploration could be transformed into reality. Yet the journey had also exposed the fragile line between glory and failure, ambition and hubris, and the human cost of discovery. Columbus's difficult return would set the stage for future voyages, political struggles, and the enduring question of what it truly meant to claim new worlds for Europe. Upon returning to Spain, Columbus found himself in a world dramatically different from the one he had left months earlier. The bustling streets of Seville and the grandeur of the royal court seemed to reflect the anticipation and excitement that had built around his journey. He had crossed the vast Atlantic, navigated unknown seas, and claimed lands unseen by European eyes. For Ferdinand and Isabella, the young monarchs eager to expand Spanish influence, Columbus embodied both daring ambition and the promise of wealth, trade, and strategic advantage. The Spanish court welcomed him with a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and cautious evaluation. Nobles, advisors, and scholars gathered to hear the tale of his voyages. Columbus, with characteristic eloquence and careful calculation, recounted the journey in vivid detail. He described the islands, the peoples he had encountered, the flora and fauna, and the potential resources of the newly discovered lands. He presented gold trinkets, exotic spices, and colorful parrots as tangible proof of the New World's bounty. Each item, each story, was a symbol of his achievements and the possibilities that lay ahead for Spain. Public recognition quickly followed. Crowds thronged the ports and city streets to catch a glimpse of the celebrated navigator. Songs, poems, and public celebrations extolled his bravery and the promise of new riches. For Columbus, the reception was both exhilarating and strategic. He knew that public acclaim would reinforce his standing with the monarchs and help secure support for future voyages. Yet beneath the applause, he remained acutely aware of the court's politics, the envy of other explorers, the scrutiny of rival nobles, and the need to maintain royal favor were ever present. Ferdinand and Isabella, impressed by his discoveries, honored Columbus with titles and privileges that reflected both their gratitude and their political aspirations. He was named Admiral of the Ocean Sea and Governor of the newly claimed territories, a recognition that granted him authority, prestige, and a degree of autonomy. These titles also carried immense responsibility. Columbus was now accountable not only for his own ventures, but also for the management, governance, and further exploration of lands thousands of miles from Spain. Despite his triumph, the challenges of his recognition were subtle but significant. Some members of the court questioned the legitimacy of his claims, while others debated the ethical and practical implications of governing distant territories. Columbus understood that while titles and ceremonies were important, the true measure of success would be the continued exploration, settlement, and resource acquisition in the Americas. The recognition he received was not merely an endpoint, it was a stepping stone to future endeavors fraught with both opportunity and risk. In private, Columbus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The dangers of the sea, the exhaustion of his crew, the uncertainties of leadership, and the moral complexities of interacting with indigenous populations all weighed on his mind. Yet the sense of accomplishment was undeniable. He had transformed a dream into reality, charted new waters, and opened the door for Europe to explore lands that had existed unknown for centuries. The chapter closes with Columbus standing at the court, celebrated and honored, yet aware that his journey was far from over. Triumph had come, but with it came responsibility, expectation, and the knowledge that the new world held challenges that no accolades could fully prepare him for. Spain had recognized his achievements, and the world had begun to notice a man who dared to sail beyond the edge of the known map, a man whose name would be remembered for centuries to come. After the acclaim and recognition he received in Spain, Columbus knew that his first voyage was only the beginning. The lands he had discovered were rich with promise, but they remained largely unknown, and much work lay ahead to establish Spain's presence across the vast Atlantic. The king and queen, impressed yet cautious, instructed Columbus to organize a second, larger expedition, one that would not only explore further, but also establish settlements, secure trade routes, and assert Spanish authority. The preparations were monumental. Spain had to provide ships, crews, supplies, and provisions capable of sustaining men for months on the open sea. Columbus, now a man of influence, but still reliant on royal resources, oversaw every detail. He selected captains and crews with care, seeking men with skill, courage, and loyalty, knowing that the success of this voyage depended on their expertise. Ships were reinforced for the transatlantic journey, carrying not only food, water, and ammunition, but also livestock, seeds, and tools to begin settlements in the New World. Columbus's mind was preoccupied with the enormity of what lay ahead. He imagined the uncharted islands, the vast oceans beyond, and the challenges of interacting with indigenous peoples whose ways of life were entirely unfamiliar. Unlike the first voyage, which had been a cautious reconnaissance, this expedition would be decisive. Colonies had to be established, resources extracted, and Spain's claims solidified against potential rival explorers from Portugal or other European powers. The political atmosphere in Spain was equally intense. Advisors debated the costs and benefits of such a large undertaking, some skeptical of Columbus's reports and the promise of wealth he claimed. Rumors and doubts circulated. Would the men survive the long journey? Would the new lands yield riches, or merely hardship? Columbus, aware of the scrutiny, was determined to prove that his vision was not only bold, but achievable. His reputation and the faith of Ferdinand and Isabella depended on success. Families of sailors and settlers faced their own anxieties. Men who had experienced the perils of the first voyage were hesitant, while those who had never ventured across the ocean were anxious yet enticed by the promise of opportunity. Columbus spent hours addressing their concerns, sharing both the dangers and the potential rewards. Leadership, he knew, required more than strategy. It demanded the ability to inspire courage and maintain morale among men who would face isolation, storms, and uncertainty for months at sea. Finally, after months of preparation, the fleet was ready. Columbus oversaw the loading of ships with meticulous attention, ensuring that no essential supply was forgotten. Maps were drawn and reviewed, and navigational instruments were carefully calibrated. Every sailor understood the gravity of the journey ahead. They were not merely crossing the Atlantic, they were venturing into the unknown, carrying the hopes of a kingdom and the ambitions of a visionary navigator. As Columbus stood on the docks, gazing at the fleet that gleamed under the Spanish sun, he felt a mix of pride, anxiety, and anticipation. This second voyage would test everything he had learned from the first, challenge his leadership, and push the limits of human endurance and courage. Spain was watching, the world was waiting, and Columbus knew that the outcome of this expedition could redefine history. With the first sails unfurling and the wind filling the canvas, Columbus embarked once again into the Atlantic, determined to transform his dreams into reality and to carve Spain's mark into lands that had never before felt the touch of Europe's presence. The second voyage of Christopher Columbus began with great anticipation, yet it quickly became clear that the journey would be far more arduous than the first. Unlike the initial expedition, which had been modest in size and scope, this voyage was enormous. Columbus commanded a fleet of 17 ships, carrying over 1,000 men, sailors, soldiers, craftsmen, priests, and settlers. Their mission was not merely exploration, but the establishment of permanent colonies and the assertion of Spanish dominion over the newly discovered lands. From the outset, the challenges tested every ounce of Columbus's leadership and resolve. The ships were crowded, and supplies were limited despite careful planning. Storms battered the fleet, tossing ships like toys in the merciless Atlantic waves. Seasickness, scurvy, and exhaustion weakened the men, while the heat of the tropics and relentless mosquitoes made life on board unbearable. Many questioned Columbus's decisions, and whispers of mutiny began to spread among the fearful and disheartened sailors. Yet Columbus pressed forward. His knowledge of navigation and the stars guided them through the vast unknown waters, and his unwavering determination inspired loyalty in many of the crew. Still, the tension was palpable. The men had left their homes for an uncertain future, and the constant threat of disease, hunger, and conflict with the native populations weighed heavily on everyone. Upon reaching the Caribbean islands, Columbus faced unexpected difficulties. Some islands appeared uninhabited, offering no immediate resources, while others were densely populated with indigenous peoples whose cultures and languages were entirely foreign. Establishing trust proved challenging, and misunderstandings sometimes escalated into violence. Columbus had to balance the objectives of exploration and colonization with diplomacy, often relying on interpreters and his own cautious judgment to navigate these delicate encounters. The reality of sustaining a settlement became starkly clear. Colonists were unaccustomed to the harsh conditions, and many struggled to adapt to life far from Europe. Food shortages, disease, and internal disputes threatened the fragile communities. Columbus, aware that the success of this expedition would define his legacy, worked tirelessly to maintain order, resolve conflicts, and ensure that the Spanish crown's interests were protected. Amid these trials, Columbus also remained hopeful. The islands offered potential wealth in the form of gold, spices, and other resources. He carefully mapped the coastline, recorded observations about the flora and fauna, and documented encounters with the indigenous peoples. Every day brought new discoveries, yet also a constant reminder of the immense difficulties involved in claiming and managing lands so distant and unfamiliar. As the months wore on, the strain on both men and ships intensified. Mutiny became a real threat, and Columbus's authority was constantly challenged. He relied on a combination of discipline, charisma, and the promise of rewards to keep the fleet together. Each decision carried immense consequences, not only for the survival of the colonists, but also for Spain's reputation and Columbus's own standing at court. Despite the hardships, Columbus pressed on, determined to fulfill the mission entrusted to him by Ferdinand and Isabella. The second voyage, with all its trials and tribulations, was a true test of endurance, leadership, and vision. It would push Columbus and his men to the limits, revealing both the perils of exploration and the possibilities that lay beyond the horizon. As the sun set over the turquoise waters of the Caribbean, Columbus gazed toward the unknown lands ahead, knowing that the challenges were far from over, and that history was being shaped with every mile sailed and every obstacle overcome. Following the successes and trials of his second voyage, Christopher Columbus faced the daunting task of transforming exploration into settlement. The dream of creating permanent Spanish colonies in the Caribbean was far more complicated than he had anticipated. The challenges were immediate and severe. the harsh tropical environment, unfamiliar diseases, scarcity of food, and the difficulty of managing a diverse group of settlers all threatened the fragile outposts. Columbus and his men had to contend with the realities of daily survival. Hurricanes and tropical storms could destroy huts and supplies in a single night. Crops failed in the unfamiliar soil, while tropical pests devoured others. Illnesses such as malaria and dysentery swept through the settlements, claiming the lives of many colonists. Columbus was forced to improvise solutions, relying on whatever local resources he could find, while constantly strategizing to maintain morale among a fearful and often unruly population. Relations with the indigenous peoples became increasingly complex. While some native communities initially welcomed the Spaniards, hoping for trade and alliances, others resisted the newcomers' demands and encroachments on their lands. Misunderstandings, cultural differences, and outright hostility often led to violent confrontations. Columbus, believing he was acting in the interest of the Spanish crown, sometimes resorted to force to assert control, a decision that would later be heavily criticized by history. Internal conflicts among the settlers further complicated the effort to establish colonies. Many were soldiers and adventurers, unaccustomed to farming, building, or enduring harsh conditions. Discontent and mutiny were constant threats, and Columbus had to exercise firm leadership to maintain order. At the same time, he faced pressure from the Spanish crown to deliver results, gold, resources, and proof that Spain's investments in the New World were worthwhile. Despite these obstacles, Columbus remained determined. He worked tirelessly, organizing expeditions to explore nearby islands, negotiate with local leaders, and search for the wealth that could sustain the colonies. He established small settlements, attempted to cultivate crops, and tried to impose a system of governance to ensure survival and loyalty. Yet each success was tempered by setbacks. Storms destroyed structures, settlers fled, and supply lines from Spain were slow and unreliable. The struggle to establish colonies was not merely a physical challenge, but a psychological and political one. Columbus had to balance the ambitions of the crown, the expectations of his men, and the realities of the land and people he encountered. His perseverance under these pressures demonstrated his vision and tenacity, even as it exposed the limits of his authority and the fragility of the colonies themselves. By the end of this period, Columbus had gained valuable experience in colonial administration, but at a steep cost. Lives had been lost, relationships with indigenous peoples were strained, and the settlements remained precarious. The dream of a thriving Spanish presence in the Caribbean was alive, but it was clear that much work remained, and that the challenges of leadership in a foreign land would continue to test Columbus and those who followed him. In the midst of adversity, Columbus's belief in his mission never wavered. Each day was a lesson in resilience, adaptation, and the relentless pursuit of discovery. The struggle to establish colonies revealed both the promise and the peril of the New World, a place of opportunity and danger, where the line between triumph and disaster was extraordinarily thin. After years of perilous voyages across the uncharted Atlantic, facing storms that threatened to swallow his ships, scurvy and disease among his crew, and the ever-present fear of mutiny, Christopher Columbus finally set sail for Spain for the last time. His life at sea had been a mixture of triumph and hardship, adventure and suffering, yet he returned with proof of lands Europeans had never seen, strange islands, exotic plants, unknown animals, and peoples whose ways of life were completely foreign to him. His homecoming was both triumphant and bittersweet, greeted with admiration but shadowed by the controversies and criticisms that had followed him for years. Upon his arrival, Columbus presented the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, with treasures from the New World, gold, pearls, spices, and even captives brought from the islands he had visited. These offerings were intended to demonstrate the potential of the lands he had discovered, and they indeed ignited a frenzy of curiosity and ambition across Europe. Monarchs, merchants, and explorers alike were fascinated by his tales of vast, unknown territories filled with promise. Maps were redrawn, expeditions planned, and the stage was set for a wave of European colonization that would forever alter the history of the globe. Yet, the later years of Columbus's life were marked by struggle and disappointment. His governance of the colonies he had founded came under intense scrutiny. Allegations of mismanagement, cruelty, and failure to maintain order among settlers created tension between Columbus and the crown. Legal battles ensued, stripping him of certain titles and privileges he had long believed were his by right. Though he had achieved what many thought impossible, crossing the Atlantic and opening up new worlds, he faced personal and professional frustrations that marred his final years. Illness and exhaustion compounded his difficulties, and he passed away in 1506, still hopeful that his discoveries would secure his place in history, yet unaware of the immense legacy his voyages would create. Columbus's impact, however, cannot be overstated. His expeditions opened the Americas to European exploration, trade, and colonization, connecting continents that had existed in isolation for millennia. The Columbian Exchange, a transfer of plants, animals, technology, culture, and even diseases, transformed societies on both sides of the Atlantic. His voyages not only altered the economic and political landscapes of Europe and the Americas, but also forever changed the lives of countless indigenous peoples. While modern perspectives critique the consequences of his actions, including the suffering of native populations, Columbus's courage, vision, and relentless pursuit of the unknown remains central to his historical significance. The story of Christopher Columbus is one of ambition, curiosity, and determination. From his childhood in Genoa, where he gazed out at the sea, dreaming of distant lands, to his tireless lobbying of European monarchs and his perilous crossings of the Atlantic, he embodies the spirit of human exploration. Every obstacle he overcame, storms, mutiny, illness, and political opposition, highlights the extraordinary resolve required to pursue a vision that many deemed impossible. His life reminds us that exploration often comes with great risk, but the rewards can change the world forever. Columbus's legacy is complex and enduring. He inspired a generation of explorers, reshaped global trade, and fundamentally altered the course of history. His name is remembered alongside the greatest navigators and pioneers, a symbol of both human curiosity and the far-reaching consequences of discovery. History teaches us that while the outcomes of exploration may be uncertain, the courage to pursue the unknown has the power to shape civilizations, economies, and cultures for centuries to come. As we close this chapter on Christopher Columbus, let the lessons of his life inspire your own journey through history. Remember the courage it takes to venture into the unknown, the persistence required to overcome challenges, and the vision needed to change the world. Subscribe to Learn History While Sleeping to continue exploring fascinating stories from the past, where every chapter brings history alive in your dreams, illuminates the triumphs and trials of those who shaped our world, and encourages curiosity that transcends time. History is waiting to be discovered, one story at a time.